"They're coming! They're coming!" cried a boy who stood with a few guards on the palisade, watching for the warriors returning to their village after a raid against a neighboring clan. The gates protecting the small settlement were opened by 4 sturdy but elderly men, ceremoniously allowing 30 warriors in leather armor and tattered red cloaks, adorned with runic patterns and a celestial boar in the center, to enter. Leading the procession was a young warrior named Filyam. He was the son of an elder, and as expected of his lineage, always strove to stand head and shoulders above his peers. Besides a short sword at his belt, he carried a bloodied sack in his hands. When the warriors formed a line, a priest and 2 elders approached them. Filyam proudly unfolded the cloth sack and pulled out a severed, blue-tinged head by the hair, its mouth agape and eyes glassy. He raised it high for everyone gathered at the entrance to see. A smirk crossed his face as he loudly declared, "The house of Vladimir the Hedgehog is vanquished, just as our elders and great ancestors decreed." The people cheered. In the market, where rare merchants brought goods and residents traded what they had, large tables were already set for a feast. Filyam proudly placed the head of the enemy on a spike, and climbing the wall, raised it above the entrance so that other tribes and families could see that it was their clan that had defeated Vladimir the Hedgehog, who had sworn loyalty to the king of Verlandia and rejected the great Yara and the 3 wolves. Dusk was falling, but the celebration was just beginning. The warriors flirted with their loved ones. Some boasted about the number of enemies they had defeated, while others simply drank, feeling the bitterness of loss. The werewolves, though they revered death, knew that worthy children of Arya ascended to the gods, where they were greeted by 3 great wolves and a mighty bear. They viewed death in battle as something sacred, a tribute to their clan, but their minds still mourned the fallen. In this campaign, some lost brothers, others beloved husbands or fathers. Tears were not absent. Filyam tried not to look at the group of women and children who had tied black scarves around their heads. They were mourning their lost relatives. This raid had claimed many lives. 18 warriors from the Vanguard clan had fallen, defending the will of the gods, and 2 remained unaccounted for amidst the ashes. But the grieving widows could not spoil his mood today. He was a hero, a warrior, the one who had brought the head of the fierce enemy of an entire people. As the goblets were refilled with wine, a young white-haired girl with green eyes approached with a jug, and leaning close, whispered in Filyam's ear, "Brave warrior, may I have a private conversation with you?" At first the question seemed inappropriate, even stunned him, but he quickly realized the conversation would be interesting. So he set the jug aside and walked towards the village gates, where an elderly werewolf, having drunk his fill of mead, now slept peacefully, snoring into his thick white beard as he stood guard. Filyam watched the road, expecting the young woman to appear soon, but saw no one. Instead, he heard girlish laughter from the other side of the wall. Nervously shivering at this, Filyam climbed the wall to see who was playing outside at such a late hour. To his surprise, he saw no one. Attributing it to drunkenness, he descended, but heard the girlish laughter again, this time near the house to the right of the entrance. "Playing tricks on me," he muttered to himself, and quickly moved towards the house, trying to make as little noise as possible. Peeking around the corner, Filyam saw only a goat, peacefully sleeping, tied to a stake driven into the ground. "What the hell?" he cursed and spat. As he turned to return to the feast, he heard a voice. "Are you looking for me, young man?" The werewolf turned sharply but saw no one. He quietly reached for the knife he always wore at his belt. "Calm down. There's no enemy here. Look up." He quickly raised his eyes to the roof, where the girl who had called him was walking barefoot, completely naked. "Have you gone mad, shameless girl? What if the elders or honest folk see you? And what? Do you think they wouldn't appreciate my body?" The girl smirked and lightly jumped to the ground, ending up face to face with Phil Yam. "I don't think it's appropriate." The warrior tried to find the right words. "Fine, I can put my dress back on. I just thought it would be easier for you if you saw me as I am." "Who are you?" Phil Yam asked, realizing he had never seen her in the village. "I am Lorda, daughter of Urgid from Wolf Mountain." She spoke these words with pride, as if where she came from was of great importance. "From Wolf Mountain?" the young man repeated. "Yes. Why does that surprise you, warrior?" "You never come down to the werewolves," the young man replied. "Look at the sky." The girl pressed close to Phil Yam and sharply turned his head. "What do you see?" "A full moon." "Exactly, warrior. A full moon is the time to continue the feast on our mountain," she whispered in his ear, brushing his skin with her crimson, moist lips. "But my kin, the feast, the village." The young man knew he wanted to follow her. The chance to feast on Wolf Mountain came to very few. "They will understand when you return with the mark," the girl smiled. The werewolf just shook his head and quietly said, "Let's go." Lorda took his hand and they walked into the dense, dark forest, quietly slipping past the wall to avoid waking the elderly guard. The moonlight illuminated the thick, gloomy thicket, making it shimmer. Phil Yam heard the crackling in the forest and smelled the fresh, frosty air that only comes in spring. The forest was filled with sounds, as if it lived and breathed separately from the rest of the world. He confidently followed the naked girl from Wolf Mountain, replaying a legend he knew by heart in his mind. "When a full moon appears in the spring sky, the one who calls herself the daughter of Urgid will come to the warriors who are the finest and strongest in their craft. Do not fear them, admire their naked forms, and follow them to Wolf Mountain, a place our gods have hidden from unworthy eyes. There, at the feast, you will savor the scent and flesh of the maiden, and in return, she will leave a mark by which every werewolf will know that Dolan, with the help of his witches, has chosen you for the Legion, so that in the hour of despair and end, you will be called upon to fight for the wolf kin." Phil Yam was afraid to let go of the maiden's hand that was leading him. Not because he might get lost in the forest. No, he knew it since childhood. In this forest, the priests had conducted his coming-of-age ritual. Here he had been given his pelt, and for the first time in the form of a wolf, he had raced through the thicket like the wind, under the howls of the adult wolves. This forest was his home. Several times he had defended it from invaders from other tribes. Here, he had first shed the blood of a man who had tried to harm his sister. Phil Yam loved and hated these woods. Here he had buried his mother and sister, a day he would never forget. When his mother, Irina, and sister, Layana, went mushroom picking, they were attacked by a stranger. He was a fugitive from Verlandia, heading to Grolgrad. That was all Phil Yam knew about the bastard. That was all the man had managed to tell before the young man tortured him, cutting off his fingers and breaking his bones. Unfortunately, by the time he heard the screams, it was too late. His mother was dead, and his sister was barely breathing, her dress torn, and she covered in blood. Seeing the young man, the attacker struck Layana with great force, pinning her to the ground with his sword before charging at Phil Yam, not realizing he would be torn apart. After their deaths, Phil Yam became a pillar for his father. He was his pride, yet he could never get enough love. Davlas, his father's name, had closed off and become very stern after losing his beloved. He did not harm or insult Filyam, but their conversations had become short and cold. The young man walked in silence, not understanding why these thoughts were coming to him. He just felt the ground slipping away and his head becoming heavy. His eyes closed. "Wake up, sleepyhead, or you'll miss the whole feast." Filyam jumped to his feet. He heard Lorda's voice, and the bright flashes of bonfires and the dancing shadows around them dazzled his eyes. "What happened to me?" "Congratulations, warrior, you're on Wolf Mountain." "Oh, don't worry about your consciousness." Lorda squatted beside Filyam so he could see all her charms. "Everyone who walks the god's path to this place falls asleep, and then Dolan himself carries you here, and you wake up surrounded by naked maidens, mead, and a great feast." The werewolf smiled, looking around and seeing dozens of naked women and men dancing around the bonfires. Some sat at tables overflowing with food and roast meat, while others indulged in carnal pleasures on the ground. "Do the gods praise all this?" he asked in surprise. "The gods grant this to you, great wolves. They grant it and send their blessings through us." Lorda lifted Filyam from the ground. "Come, we need to do the ritual painting." He obediently followed the girl, eyeing the naked maidens bathing each other in wine and caressing one of the warriors from the Fald clan, recognizable by his clan mark of severed ears and a shaved head. Entering one of the huts the witches of Wolf Mountain built as their dwellings, the young man saw numerous runes, raven skulls, divination stones, and sheep pelts. "This is my home," Lorda said proudly. "Undress. Tonight you will bathe your body in the light of the bonfires and the full moon." "All right." Filyam smiled, surprising even himself with his boldness. He quickly shed all his clothes, revealing a muscular body covered in scars from wolf bites and claws. Some were fresh, others old and faded. The girl took a wooden bowl from one of the makeshift shelves and approached him closely. She deeply inhaled the scent of her chosen one for the night, gently ran her hand over his chest, and began dipping her fingers into the paint, applying intricate patterns on him. His chest, legs, arms, face, and even his manhood were covered in paint, depicting the sign of the divine wolf, the Kolyadnik, and other complex runes and symbols. "Your turn," Lorda playfully said, handing the bowl to Filyam. The young man hesitantly looked at the paint, then at the girl's chest, shoulders, and face. He did not understand what he feared, but dipping his fingers into the paint, he made 2 streaks on her cheeks, resembling bloody tears, and painted patterns on the rest of her body. "Done. Now you are painted too." "Excellent. Now let's celebrate." Lorda threw the paint aside, grabbed Filyam's hand, and led him out of the hut to the bonfires. She laughed and immediately brought him to a table, quickly filling wooden cups with mead. Handing one to the young man, she began to drink greedily, letting the drops trickle down the corners of her mouth. "You have quite the thirst," Filyam noted with surprise. "You see, in your world you can drink whenever you want. We, the witches of Wolf Mountain, are allowed to drink only once a year. And believe me, none of my sisters will miss the chance to dull their minds with mead. Me included." The young man also took a sip of mead and was surprised by its taste. "What's with it?" He pointed at the cup. "It is made from a recipe given by the gods to the daughters of Urgid, the first wife of Dolan. Only here, among us, can you drink such a thing. And how do you live here?" He was genuinely curious to know how those so closely tied to the gods existed. "Like everyone else. We sow wheat, make things, tend to cows. Sometimes we venture into your world, wandering from village to village. working as midwives, healing and casting spells, cursing and lifting curses. When we grow tired, we return here. Not much like the life of a werewolf. Why? You also wander from village to village, tearing out the throats of your brothers, saving other brothers. It is the warrior's path. We did not choose it. It was bequeathed by the great Arya, Skolia, and Dolan. So be it. Lorda set her empty cup on the table and smiled, pressing her lips to Filyam's. The young man dropped his mead to the ground, and feeling the taste of sweet, moist lips, kissed back more passionately, letting his hand slide from her slender waist to her firm hips, and then to her chest. Filyam barely pulled away from the alluring body, finding it unusual, though any woman's body was unusual for a celebrated warrior. Let's join the others. Lorda led Filyam to the bonfire, where to the sound of drums and tambourines, flutes and pipes, the brothers danced, intertwining their hands with the daughters of Urgid. The young man did not notice how his feet began to tap the rhythm, and his gaze met Lorda's joyful eyes. Songs flowed one after another. Dances were replaced by cups of mead and shouts. The merry sounds turned into fierce cries among the warriors. Filyam curiously watched as several werewolves quarreled over the witches. But the fight never took place. The daughters of Urgid quickly calmed the drunk warriors with their lips and bodies. You know, I never doubted you would come for me on one of these nights. Filyam, you are arrogant. Lorda looked intently into the gleaming eyes of the werewolf. Somewhere nearby, a howl and loud female laughter rang out, drawing the attention of many revelers that night. It's not boasting. I have participated in many battles and won them all, Filyam said with a smile. Soon the games will begin, and I think you'll have a chance to prove yourself. What kind of games are these? The glorious wolves will fight for the right to the night. Lorda caught the surprised look on her and immediately understood the silent question. The winner will be able to lie with the High Priestess, the one who faithfully serves Dolan, passing his will to the daughters of Urgid. Let me be clear. This is the highest honor for a warrior. He and his son will swear loyalty to Dolan, and if a daughter is born, she can stay among us and learn the secrets of magic and healing. Indeed, very honorable. Do you want to participate? Lorda looked at Filyam suspiciously. All warriors should do this. You said so yourself. Not all. Only those who find the affection and love of Urgid's daughter insufficient tonight. Those whose blood boils and cannot cool down. Warriors destined to swallow clots of enemy blood. Is the battle to the death? Filyam asked cautiously. Yes. It never happens that a defeated warrior lives. It is a disgrace and dishonor to him and his entire lineage. You are right. Lorda laughed in the young man's face, then leaned closer and whispered in his ear, Do you still want to be the best? Or do you prefer to taste the woman tonight? Are you provoking me? Filyam asked, raising his voice. So be it. You have the honor of being here, but I see by your restless eyes, feel by the beating of your heart, that such honors are not enough for you. You are insatiable and want more. My father always taught me to push forward, to lead the pack, not to trail behind the leader. Feeling something sinister in Lorda's words, Filyam tried to justify his desire, trying to make the witch from the Wolf Mountain understand him. Your father wanted to lead the pack, not you, Filyam. I see how greedily you devour me with your eyes. I see how your hands tremble when they get to touch me. I know more about you, Filyam, than you think. You know everything? An unpleasant chill ran down his spine. The intoxicating and mesmerizing witch attracted him even more. With each sip of mead, with each of her words, he was drifting away from reality, falling into oblivion. "You are like an open book to me. I know how your mother and sister died. I know that your father kept you at a distance, depriving you of affection and love. He demanded that you push forward, as he says, lead the pack. Filyam." The girl rose from her knees and, standing tall, loudly proclaimed, "I, Lorda, witch from the Wolf Mountain, prophetess and seductress, the one who chooses the best warrior every year. Believe me, I know everything about everyone, just as my sisters know about everyone. This is the gift Mother Urgid left to her daughters. We are not the children of Yaros, we are the children of wolves and ravens. And ravens see in all four directions." Filyam recoiled. He saw Lorda's eyes darken, her skin covered with veins, and her voice trembled as if the roar of a wild beast was tearing the sky apart. He stepped back slightly, watching as the witch's face returned to its original state, but her smile remained frozen in a distorted, eerie expression. "Do not be afraid," she suddenly said, as if nothing had happened. "You will lead the pack since you find me insufficient." Filyam recoiled. Everything happening around him was becoming darker and more unpleasant, and every word of Lorda made him think more about leaving the sacred feast of the werewolves. The girl quickly approached the massive wooden table and, grabbing 2 clay cups, came back. "Drink. I see how nervous you are. Glorious warrior of your tribe." The girl's eyes sparkled with malice. Filyam, as if enchanted, obediently took what Lorda offered him and began to drink greedily. The alcohol burned his throat, not mead or wine water. Even the infusions were not this strong. He felt something dark and thick spreading through his body, burning him from the inside. Everything started to blur before his eyes, and the beautiful, voluptuous witches from the Wolf Mountain began to turn into wild, bird-like monsters. Filyam dropped the cup from his hands, his body started to shake, and the laughing Lorda grabbed his hand and dragged him to the fire where the other bird-like sisters were gathering. The girl herself began to be covered with feathers, her legs changing, taking the shape of ravens' claws, her nails lengthening and becoming stronger. Filyam only shook his head, unable to open his mouth, feeling weak, and a moment later he was lying on the ground, and the predatory witch continued to drag him towards the fire. Throwing him like a rag towards the fire, she laughed. Filyam, unwillingly, stood on all fours in the form of a wolf, growling and foaming at the mouth. Around him were wild, terrible beasts, birds and wolves, some bodies entwined like the desecrated snakes of Yarnafarg, blood pounding in his temples, and soon he felt warmth and pain in his scruff. The wolves were gnawing and growling. He snapped his jaws, howling at the full moon, which coldly watched everything with the lone eye of Arya. The children of wolves, sons of bears and ravens, were gnawing at each other around the huge naked fire, whose flame danced sweetly and desirably like a naked maiden. His head was filled with music. Filyam heard how the runes and ligatures flowed from the beaks of the ravenous black ravens above the battle and continued to drink the blood of his brothers. Enemies fell one by one, and pieces of meat, mead, and wine, strong spirits burning his torn body, were thrown towards the warrior, and the lone eye of the moon closed on the sky. The predatory birds gathered around him again, taking the forms of maidens, their snow-white breasts rubbing against his face and legs. He felt like he was drowning in a vast ocean of naked maidens with predatory grins. A hand tightened around Filyam's neck, pulling him out of the tangled mass of bodies, lips pressed against his, and a tongue greedily penetrated his mouth, then his throat, and like an ancient spirit, licked his insides, penetrating as deeply as steel would not. She held his hands, legs. He felt her heat. The sweaty body from the fire drew him in more and more, causing his foggy mind to shut down. Philyam opened his eyes heavily. Frozen, covered in dirt, he lay naked in the forest. His head was splitting with such force that tears welled up in his eyes. The attempt to get up succeeded only on the fourth try. Scraping his shoulders and knees, he fell into the branches and leaves. When strength filled his legs and he felt the ground, the warrior began to orient himself where the cursed daughter of Irgid had thrown him. Painful black and orange flashes of memories surfaced in his head, making him convulsively clench. Wandering among the pines, Philyam saw familiar wooden walls. On shaky legs, he managed to reach the palisade and hear the shouts of the men guarding it. He has returned. Call Davlis and the elders. Philyam began to get nervous, the men standing on the palisade staring at him. At their shout, boys who always lingered around the guard post, sometimes running errands for food or milk, began to peek out from behind the walls. Open the gate, Philyam said, trying to gather his strength loud enough to be heard. But the guards only began whispering among themselves, and the young man felt a prickly lump in his throat. A few minutes later, his father appeared on the wall. Davlis looked at his son carefully, sometimes shaking his head. "Father, what is happening?" Philyam asked. The man was silent. Only the elder appeared near Davlis's shoulder and gasped after a second. "Blessed gods, what have they done to you? I do not understand what is happening. Let me into the village, father." Philyam was seriously nervous. He felt his legs start to tremble, his palms growing cold and sweaty. He frantically looked at the faces of everyone gathered on the palisade. "Where did you spend the night, child of our clan?" The elder continued to ask questions. Philyam hesitated, trying to recall everything that had happened at night. Replaying the horror in his mind and taking a deep breath, he said, "I was on the Wolf Mountain. The daughters of Irgid invited me to this feast." In response, Philyam heard only frightened gasps and a tense, fussy quarrel among those standing on the palisade. Davlis closed his eyes and lowered his head. "Do you want to say that the daughters of Irgid chose you?" his father asked. "Yes, father. What is happening? I do not understand you." Philyam nervously shook his head. "Open the gates," the elder said quietly. The guards exchanged doubtful glances but still followed the elder's order, opening the gates. Philyam slowly entered his native village. The girls and women avoided him. The men only closed their eyes, trying not to look at the young man. Yesterday he entered here as a hero, and today people looked at him as if he had stolen the last bread from their table. Father and the elder descended from the palisade and blocked Philyam's path. The elder looked him in the eyes and said, "Foolish child. Chasing after a legend, you did not think about where the warriors go after the feast. Tell me, did you see your reflection in the water?" "No," Philyam said in a trembling voice. Someone handed him a small round shield. What he saw shocked him. The shield fell to the ground and Philyam began to nervously look around. His face was covered with a thin layer of black fur resembling needles. Veins on his chest had turned black, and his eyes were red, as if filled with blood. He fell to his knees and began to moan. "What have they done to me? Father, elder, what has happened to me?" Tears started to flow from Philyam's eyes. "You have been chosen for their legion," Davlis responded dryly and coldly, his lips white with anger. "Father, the legends say that I will become a great wolf if Irgid's daughter chooses me. So it is. Now you will become the great wolf of our clan. But the price for this will not be small, Filyam." Davlis turned, and pushing through the onlookers, left, leaving his own son lying on the ground at the elder's feet in tears and dirt. "What should I do?" Filyam moaned. "Take your things and food and just leave us. When the time comes, you will hear Dolan's call and go to him forever." The elder turned to the crowd. "Bring him what I said." "Where will I go? What have they done to me?" Almost losing his mind, Filyam began to shout. It was not long before a bundle of food and someone's clothes was carelessly thrown to him. "Dress and leave our walls," the elder said sternly. "And you all, look at him as an example. Filyam, yesterday's warrior of Arya and Skolia, child of Yar, today became a child of Urgid and Dolan. He changed his kin, deceived by the gods. He will serve in the darkness of the night stars to his masters until his time comes to rise like a phoenix from the ashes and protect our entire kin. Do not turn your faces from him, for he gives his soul to be torn apart as a martyr in the name of our future." After the elder spoke, he walked away. The crowd remained, surrounding Filyam, who had managed to put on pants and a shirt. They gave him bast shoes made of bark and a woolen cloak. Frightened, looking into the eyes of those with whom he had shared mead just last evening, the young man left the village, walking back into the forest, where he had woken up. The gates closed behind him, and he began to wander among the trees. He could not think, only his insides twisted with resentment. Ancient legends lie. They drive young werewolves mad, leading them to a place where the truth is distorted. Filyam wandered the forest for a long time until he began to feel his stomach twist with hunger. Sitting on an old, rotten stump, he untied the bundle. Bread and a couple of eggs. That was all they had given him in his native village. Quickly eating them, he did not feel full, and in addition to the gnawing hunger, thirst also set in. Finding a stream was not difficult, but his hands had been aching for several hours. His legs were worn, and Filyam was cold and tired. Getting used to it, suddenly a voice echoed among the trees. The young man jumped off the stump and looked around, seeing no one in the forest. Then he looked up at the branches and saw Lorda. The girl sat high in the branches, smiling, swinging her bare feet, and staring at Filyam. "Cursed girl!" the young man shouted. The girl only laughed in response. "Rough! The night spent with us spoils you all. You should rejoice, Filyam, that you were chosen and did not lose your head in that bloody dance by the fire." "What have you done to me? I am now without home and kin. Soon everything will change for the better. You will have a home and kin. Everything you wish for, child of Dolan. You just have to wait. Turn everything back as it was." Filyam groaned, falling to his knees. "I beg you, fix this, Lorda. It is not my will, Filyam. You were chosen by Urgid and Dolan. Their will is unquestionable. Wasn't this what you wanted? You wanted to become a great warrior. You have become one." The girl's voice turned cold, filled with offense and anger. "Lorda, I beg you, help me. I do not want to be like this." Filyam spread his hands, showing his face. "Last night you wanted it more than beer and me. I was not enough for you, warrior. The gods gave what you demanded. Now you will lead the pack." Suddenly the girl turned into a raven, and flapping her wings flew away, leaving only the branches slightly swaying. Filyam fell to the ground. He howled like a child, tearing up last year's grass from the wet ground thawed by snow. He howled and scratched with his feet, realizing what he had done. But understanding was not enough. Suddenly Filyam's body began to ache. It seemed as if something unknown was twisting his legs and arms, making his bones crack. His head was ringing, and an ancient voice began to chant in his ears. The young man writhed and moaned, feeling his skin start to burn. His legs began to bend unnaturally, his body covered with black, sharp as blades fur, his face turned into a wolf's muzzle, and his mouth filled with dozens of sharp silver fangs. The scream turned into a howl, a wild, blood-chilling howl. Philyam's eyes closed. He came to and shook his head heavily. He tried to stand, but realized he was trapped in a wolf's body. It has happened, he thought heavily. Standing on all fours, he squeezed his eyes shut, sighed, and let out a long howl. Exhaling, he decided he needed to turn back into a human and go to the nearest village with which his kin was not at war. Without food and clothing, in such cold weather, he would not last long. But what happened next was unexpected. Instead of turning back into a human, Philyam felt a burning pain throughout his body and fell to the ground. He could not believe what was happening. The black, fur-covered paws remained wolfish. Again and again, he tried to transform, but each time it felt like he was being poured with boiling oil. The young man howled again, scaring the birds peacefully sitting in the night darkness on the branches of trees. Only one raven continued to watch his agony. "Lorda!" the wolf growled, then rushed to run wherever his eyes would lead. Philyam did not distinguish roads and paths, knocking down thin branches with his wolf body. He weaved among the trees, his paws heavy, breaking twigs and crumpling last year's leaves. It seemed time had stopped, and the night had forever enveloped the black wolf when his run suddenly stopped. Philyam looked into the distance and saw the lights of a palisade standing as a black, blurry spot in a small field surrounded by birches. "I don't think they will welcome you there." A female voice echoed in the wolf's head. Philyam began to circle but could not find the cursed raven that had been following him the whole run. "Let the curse consume you," Philyam howled. "I can leave you here forever in the black fur." "Let it be as you wish, Philyam," Lorda said sternly in his head. The wolf was silent. Now he realized what was happening to him, understood that he had spat on Lorda and her invitation when he decided to rush into the battle for the best warrior. "Are you taking revenge on me?" he asked mentally the raven. The bird quietly descended to the ground in front of the wolf and looked at him, tilting its head slightly. "No, just giving you what you wanted. I offended you. Spat on your mercy, daughter of Urgid. I admit I understand this, but please, return everything as it was." Philyam was almost crying. "Fool." The bird suddenly took to the sky and disappeared. The wolf howled and growled, trying to become human again. The fur burned him more than before, and he fell to the ground exhausted. Breathing heavily, he rose on his paws and slowly walked towards the outpost standing in the field. Approaching the walls, he heard a harp and a cheerful song. Philyam did not know what kind of kin lived there, could not imagine what awaited him, but hoped for help. Only the elders knew how to shed the black, prickly fur of Dolan's son. Wandering near the walls, he did not dare attract attention for a long time. He was afraid they would attack him, but as soon as Philyam decided to howl, the night silence was broken by a cry. A wolf, a black wolf at the walls. In an instant, torches began to light up along the wall. Cries rose and an arrow stuck in the ground near his paw. Philyam did not wait any longer. Only whining, he rushed back into the forest. The gates opened, and with wild howls and growls, about a dozen white wolves ran after him. Several men rode with torches in hand, trying to corner him. A sling whistled, and Philyam felt a sharp pain in his back. Wolf bones crunched. He fell to the ground, unable to catch his breath, and several jaws immediately sank into the wolf. The wolves gnawed and bit Philyam, but he felt that only part of the fangs pierced his flesh. The wolves whimpered and jumped back. The fur of the black wolf stood on end with sharp, shiny, silver-black spikes covering his flesh. The sling whistled and a heavy metal ball struck the tree nearby. Splinters and bark flew to the side. Filyam, ignoring the pain and fatigue, rushed deep into the forest, weaving among the trees and jumping over bushes. He heard the pursuit come to a halt, heard the silence of the horses and the wolves growl. But inside, everything was trembling. He didn't want to stop, running and running until he collapsed on the ground from exhaustion. His heavy black sides heaved, trying to fill his depleted wolf body with air. The wolf's eyes closed from fatigue, and no matter how much Filyam tried to keep them open, sleep took over. As soon as the sun rose over the forest, the black wolf opened his eyes. The wounds on his body seemed to have vanished. He was surprised that the pain no longer tormented him. Rising to his feet, he tried again to turn back into a human, but it was all in vain. Burning pain, sharp blows to the bones, howling. It all repeated. Filyam realized that he could not become human, could not regain his form. He understood that he needed to find Lorda. Until she forgave him, the curse would not lift. He made no plans for searching for her, as he had no idea where to find Urgid's daughter. All he could do was wander through the forests and wait for her to come to him again. The wolf's stomach ached with hunger. He had eaten nothing but a few eggs and bread since the previous morning. Filyam carefully looked at his paws and tried to figure out what to do. He didn't want to admit to himself that hunting was his only option. As a simple wolf, he had chased down prey, caught rabbits in his animal form, but he had never eaten them raw. The very thought made him uneasy. The animal form was a gift for battle and hunting, but not for devouring raw game. But fate and Lorda left him no choice. Gathering his strength, the black wolf began sniffing for prey. He roamed the dense forest, listening to his surroundings. The sun had long passed midday when he spotted a rabbit. Its fur had not yet changed color, and the speckled white-brown creature sat by a shrub. Filyam gathered his strength and in one leap reached the prey. His sharp silver fangs mercilessly clamped down on the rabbit's head, crushing it. To ensure the kill, Filyam shook the prey side to side and then laid it on the grass. He looked at the prey intently, and closing his wolf eyes, began tearing the rabbit apart and swallowing the sweet meat. Filled with blood, scent, and taste, it seemed like he was drinking it from a cup. Overcoming himself, he left no piece of the rabbit uneaten. Only bones crushed by his fangs, remnants of fur, and a bloodstain with bits of uneaten flesh and entrails remained. The hunger subsided, but with it came an unpleasant, nauseating, bloody mush in his stomach. Filyam didn't know how long he could last like this, but he had no choice. He couldn't return to his native village either. So he simply wandered further into the forest, hoping that Lorda would soon come to him. Snow slowly fell to the ground. A young boy in a bear fur coat carefully stepped through the trees towards the stockade of his home village. In his hands, he carried several fish strung on a rope. Fishing in winter was difficult, but it never stopped him. This time, having spent almost the entire day in the cold, he proudly returned home with a decent catch for that time of year. He was already anticipating his mother frying the fish in the stove and cooking some porridge. The boy's stomach growled, signaling that it was time for dinner. Without looking around, he continued walking through the trees. There was a crunch, and a heavy wolf body fell on the boy from above. There was no scream. Sharp silver fangs pierced the boy, tearing out his throat and lower jaw. Blood sprayed onto the fresh snow, staining it with red spots. The body convulsed, and blood rhythmically splattered onto the snarling face of the huge black wolf. The beast stood over the body, staring into the remains of the face. He smelled the fresh blood and warm meat, tearing through the fur coat as he sniffed the body, ripping the clothes. His fangs repeatedly sank into the flesh, mercilessly tearing off pieces. He understood that before him lay the grandson of the elder, the one who had brought him a bag of bread and eggs many years ago. But he couldn't stop. The unrestrained hunger burned within him, making him ravage the boy's flesh. The tender meat both sated him and ignited an unbearable heat inside. Sweet metallic blood spread across his tongue. Human flesh clung to the roof of his mouth, leaving an unforgettable trail of flavors and emotions. Filyam could no longer control himself, only burying his muzzle deeper into the human flesh, tearing off another chunk of the boy he had once known, back when he himself lived in this village with his kin. Suddenly, the wolf stopped. He looked up and saw a black raven sitting on a bare branch of a shrub. He paid it no mind and continued eating. "Well, hello, Filyam," a voice echoed in the wolf's head. The beast abruptly pulled back from the prey and stared with cold, blood-filled eyes at the bird. "I see you've become a true beast." The wolf remained silent, marveling at how he even understood what this creature was saying. "Don't you recognize me? The gods were right when they told me I would drive you mad with my resentment." "Lorda," the wolf growled with difficulty. He hadn't heard speech in a long time, couldn't remember how it sounded or why it was needed. "That's right. To be honest, I thought you would forget my name after 14 long years." The wolf looked at his paws, then at the mangled body. He raised his eyes to the raven and said, 14 years. "Yes, you spent 14 years in a black hide. The gods told me it was time to take you away from here to give you food and shelter. You've served your punishment for your ignorance. Tell me, are you ready to follow me?" "Yes," the wolf growled submissively. He slowly approached the raven, and suddenly the whole space around him filled with golden light. As if something flashed before his eyes, and he found himself on the very mountain where Lorda had led him as a young man. He slowly walked with his black paws along the tents and wooden shacks. To the wolf's surprise, there was no snow here. In the center stood a huge bonfire, around which Urgid's daughters walked. The raven turned into a maiden. The wolf saw that Lorda hadn't changed at all over the years. Her body was still beautiful and alluring. Suddenly, he stopped and said, "I don't want to be here. Take me back to the forest." "What?" The girl was surprised. "You couldn't shed your wolf's hide for so many years, and now when I've forgiven you and brought you back, you ask to be returned?" "Yes. This is not my world anymore. I can't feel at home here. My world is the hunt and the constant run. The blood and flesh of beasts and men. Dolan himself ordered to bring you here, and you will go to him." Lorda began to get angry. "First our god will see you, and then you can go wherever you please." Filyam submissively lowered his head. He followed her, ignoring everything else. At the edge of the mountain, he saw him, an enormous black wolf, proudly gazing at the horizon. Urgid's daughters and 4 black wolves like Filyam swirled around Dolan. "Come to me," said Dolan. Filyam obediently approached his god, and lowering himself to his paws, bowed his head. "You are my son, my child who has wandered away from his family and kin for so many years. I am glad I was able to find you in these forests. I am glad that you can take your place in our pack. Father, I don't need this." Suddenly, to his own surprise, Filyam spoke in human language. I have lived in the forests among the beasts for many years. My kin and my home are there now, Father." Dolan remained silent. Only in an instant he turned into a man and approached Phil-Yam. He grabbed the wolf's head and Phil-Yam felt a searing pain. He howled, but the howl turned into a scream. Dolan removed his hand and took a few steps back. Phil-Yam breathed heavily, seeing human hands instead of paws, but not believing what was happening. Tentatively, he clenched his fingers, felt his face. Suddenly, he started laughing, jumped to his feet, felt his body, and couldn't believe the wolf's hide had fallen from him. "Phil-Yam," Dolan addressed him again. The young man, who hadn't changed at all over the years, fell silent abruptly, Dolan's voice tearing him from his euphoria. He turned and looked at his god. "Without me, you will never be able to shed the black hide. Going into the embrace of nature, you will forever remain a beast without memory and will. Only instinct and a thirst for blood will drive you to a bloody hunt time and again. This is your last word, to leave or to stay." The young man couldn't believe what was happening to him, looking nervously at the 4 black wolves, then at Dolan, then at Lorda, who was watching all this. Phil-Yam began to mumble. "I stay," he forced out heavily. "Good." Dolan approached the young man, took a short dagger with a wide leaf-shaped blade from a small sheath at his waist, and running it across his palm, released divine blood. Then he pressed his bloody palm to Phil-Yam's mouth and said, "Drink." The young man was frightened, once again feeling human fear and emotions. But he couldn't defy what the god himself commanded. He began to drink the blood flowing from the god's hand. It wasn't disgusting. The taste of wine and honey filled his mouth, and his body felt energized. Phil-Yam began to fall into a trance, greedily swallowing drop after drop of the divine wine-like blood. Suddenly, Dolan disappeared. Phil-Yam stood on his feet, looking around the place where the god and his 4 black wolves had just been. He started turning his head, thinking it was all another trick, but then he met Lorda's eyes. "Welcome to the family, Phil-Yam," she smiled. The young man saw that the girl's smile forebode nothing good. He felt danger emanating from her. "Tell me, my dear boy." She approached him closely and pressed against him. "How does it feel to be a great warrior?" "What do you want from me, Lorda?" Phil-Yam said coldly, as if afraid of being burned on the spot. "Nothing." The girl stepped away from him and looked into his eyes. "My desires remain the same, my dear Phil-Yam, just as they were 14 years ago. I simply want to be with you." The young man watched closely as other daughters of Urgid gathered around him and Lorda, some of them clearly concerned about what was happening. "You want me to be with you?" Phil-Yam asked again. "No. I want to know if you want to be a great warrior, if you are still hungry for glory. Are you still prideful, or have you realized all that you did in this place many years ago?" "No," Phil-Yam said quietly and humbly, lowering his head. "Good." Lorda approached the young man and kissed him. "Let's go inside. It's almost time for dinner." The daughter of Urgid took the young man by the hand and led him to the tent where 14 years ago she had painted symbols on him, to the place where it had all begun 14 long years ago.